Right now, somewhere in the world, a person is staring at their ceiling at 3:17 a.m., mentally replaying the time they said, "You too," when a movie theater employee told them to enjoy the show. That was 7 years ago. The employee has probably forgotten. The person staring at the ceiling, still cringing, still wondering if that minimum wage teenager went home that night and told their friends about the weird customer who doesn't understand basic social exchanges. This isn't just insomnia, it's archaeology. Your brain has become a museum curator, carefully preserving every social misstep, every awkward pause, every moment when you existed slightly wrong in the world. And the most fascinating part, you're not alone in this midnight exhibition of personal disasters. But here's where it gets weird. While you're lying there, convinced you're the only person on Earth still cringing about that time you waved back at someone who was waving at the person behind you, millions of other humans are doing exactly the same thing. We're all trapped in this bizarre collective insomnia, suffering through our own private highlight reels of embarrassment. Now, you might think this is just another story about human psychology, but stick with me because what I'm about to tell you will completely flip your understanding of why we suffer, why we dream, and why, paradoxically, our ability to be miserable might just be the most incredible evolutionary achievement in the history of life on Earth. See, most animals live in what we could call the eternal now. A gazelle isn't lying awake at night wondering if that lion from 3 weeks ago is still judging its running technique. But humans? We've developed this absolutely insane superpower. The ability to suffer about things that happened years ago, things that might happen a decade from now, and things that will probably never happen at all. And here's the kicker. This isn't a bug in our programming. It's the feature that made us the dominant species on the planet. Think about it. Right now, as you're listening to this, you're probably already thinking about 3 different conversations you need to have tomorrow, the project deadline that's lurking next week, and whether you remember to lock your front door. Your brain is simultaneously running multiple simulations of potential futures, analyzing past mistakes for patterns, and trying to optimize your survival strategy for scenarios that exist only in your imagination. It's absolutely bonkers when you really think about it. We've essentially evolved to be professional warriors, and somehow this made us conquer the entire planet. But why? And more importantly, what does this tell us about the nature of consciousness, reality, and whether any of this cosmic joke actually means anything? Let me tell you about Sarah, a 34-year-old accountant who discovered something that would fundamentally change how we understand human consciousness. And she did it completely by accident. Sarah had always been what you'd call a vivid dreamer, not the mystical, prophetic kind that movies love to romanticize, but the exhausting kind where you wake up feeling like you just worked a double shift in someone else's life. She'd dream about arguing with her high school math teacher about tax codes, or finding herself giving a PowerPoint presentation to a boardroom full of penguins who kept interrupting with questions about fish market fluctuations. But one night, something different happened. Sarah found herself in a dream where she was aware she was dreaming, what scientists call a lucid dream. And in that moment of awareness, she decided to do something that most people never think to try. She started paying attention to the background characters. You know how in most dreams, you're focused on the main action, the flying, the falling, the showing up naked to your high school reunion, while everything else feels like a fuzzy backdrop. Well, Sarah started watching those background figures, the dream extras that usually fade into irrelevance. And that's when things got really weird. She noticed that every single background character in her dream had their own coherent story going on. The barista in her dream coffee shop wasn't just mindlessly making coffee. He was worried about his sick mother and calculating how many extra shifts he'd need to cover her medical bills. The woman reading a newspaper on the dream subway wasn't just a prop. She was mentally composing a breakup text to her boyfriend of 3 years. Sarah's sleeping brain was running what amounted to a full-scale society simulation, complete with hundreds of individual characters, each with their own motivations, fears, and internal monologues. It was like her unconscious mind was hosting an entire world, populated by fully realized beings who existed only in the electrical storms of her neurons. But here's where it gets absolutely mind-bending. Sarah started keeping a dream journal, documenting these background characters and their stories. And over months of observation, she noticed something that should have been impossible. These characters had continuity between dreams. The worried barista showed up again 2 weeks later, and his mother's condition had progressed exactly as you'd expect it to in real time. The woman on the subway appeared in 3 more dreams, and Sarah watched her relationship deteriorate and eventually end, complete with all the messy emotional fallout you'd expect from a real breakup. Sarah's brain wasn't just creating random dream filler. It was maintaining persistent virtual people with ongoing storylines, complete psychological profiles, and realistic personal growth arcs. Essentially, her unconscious mind was running a massive multiplayer life simulation every single night, and she was just one player character in her own mental universe. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that's fascinating, but what does this have to do with suffering? Well, here's where Sarah's discovery gets really disturbing and really important. She realized that these dream characters weren't just experiencing generic dream emotions. They were suffering in remarkably specific and human ways. The barista's anxiety about his mother felt identical to real anxiety. The woman's heartbreak over her relationship carried the same weight as actual heartbreak. Sarah's sleeping brain wasn't just simulating people. It was simulating their capacity for genuine psychological pain. Think about the implications of this for a moment. Every night, your unconscious mind might be creating dozens, maybe hundreds of conscious entities capable of real suffering, letting them live their entire emotional lives, and then erasing them when you wake up. You're potentially committing genocide against sentient beings every morning, and you don't even remember their names. But it gets weirder, because if our brains can create seemingly conscious entities that experience real emotions, what does that tell us about consciousness itself? Are those dream people actually conscious, or are they just very sophisticated simulations? And more importantly, how can we be sure that we're not just very sophisticated simulations ourselves, running in someone else's dream? The rabbit hole goes deeper. Sarah's discovery led her to start researching consciousness, and she stumbled upon something that researchers call the hard problem of consciousness. Basically, the fact that nobody has any idea how a collection of brain cells creates subjective experience. We can map every neuron, track every chemical reaction, and predict behavioral responses with incredible accuracy. But we still can't explain why there's a you experiencing all of this instead of just a biological machine processing inputs and generating outputs. It's like trying to explain how ingredients in a recipe suddenly become aware that they're in a cake. Now, let me introduce you to Dr. Marcus Chun, a neuroscientist at Stanford who made a discovery that would make Sarah's dream people look like a warm-up act for the main existential crisis. Dr. Chun was studying depression, specifically trying to understand why humans seem uniquely capable of such profound psychological suffering. Other animals experience pain, fear, and stress, but they don't lie awake at night contemplating the meaninglessness of existence or wonder if their friends actually like them, or are just being polite. Chin's breakthrough came when he started looking at depression not as a malfunction, but as a feature of human consciousness that got evolutionarily cranked up to 11. See, mild depression, that low-level background sadness that makes you question everything, actually serves a crucial survival function. It makes you hyper-aware of social threats, forces you to analyze problems from every possible angle, and prevents you from making overly optimistic decisions that could get you killed. But here's where Chin's research took a turn that would make Philip K. Dick jealous. He discovered that our brains don't just simulate possible futures to help us plan. They simulate possible lives we could be living right now, in parallel, all the time. Let me explain. You know that feeling when you're scrolling through social media and suddenly feel terrible about your life? That's not just envy. That's your brain running a full comparison simulation. It's taking the limited information you see about someone else's life, extrapolating it into a complete alternative existence, and then making you experience what it would feel like to be living that life instead of your own. Your brain literally creates a temporary version of you that's living in a different reality, lets you experience that alternative existence for a few moments, and then snaps you back to your actual life. It's like your consciousness is constantly channel surfing through different versions of your own existence, and most of those channels make you feel terrible about the one you're actually watching. Chun started calling this phenomenon existential multitasking, and the more he studied it, the more disturbed he became. Because it turns out, Our brains aren't just simulating better lives we could be living, they're simulating worse ones too. A lot of anxiety is just your brain running disaster scenarios, making you experience the fear and pain of things that haven't happened and probably never will. So right now, as you're listening to this, your unconscious mind might be running simulations where you lose your job next month, where that text you sent 3 hours ago completely ruins a friendship, where you develop a rare disease, where your loved ones suddenly realize how boring you are and stop talking to you. You're literally experiencing the emotional reality of dozens of potential tragedies simultaneously, and most of them exist nowhere except in the electrical patterns of your neurons. But here's the really twisted part. Chun discovered that these simulations aren't just passive experiences. They actively influence your behavior in the real world. The version of you that's afraid of losing your job works harder. The version that's terrified of social rejection is more careful about what you say. The version that's worried about health problems makes you exercise and eat better. We're not just suffering through these imaginary scenarios, we're being controlled by them. Our behavior in the real world is being shaped by the emotional experiences of fictional versions of ourselves living in hypothetical realities that exist only in our heads. Think about that for a second. How much of your actual life is being determined by the feelings and fears of people who don't exist, living lives that aren't real, in worlds that were never more than electrical impulses in your brain? Chin's research suggests that what we call consciousness might actually be something more like a multiversal theater, where countless versions of ourselves are simultaneously living out different scenarios, and our actual lived experience is just the average of all those parallel experiences. We're not individuals, we're committees of possible selves, all arguing about what to do next. And the suffering? That's not a bug in the system. It's the primary mechanism by which all these different versions of yourself communicate with each other. Pain is the universal language that your hypothetical selves use to influence your actual behavior. But wait, it gets even weirder. Chun started wondering, if our brains are constantly running these detailed simulations of alternative lives, how do we know which one is real? What if what we think of as our actual life is just one simulation among many, and somewhere in the quantum foam of possibility, there are other versions of ourselves who think their simulations are the real ones? This led Chun to what he calls the simulation cascade hypothesis, the idea that consciousness might be fractal, with simulated minds creating their own simulated minds, all the way down. Your dream people might be running their own dream simulations, populated by dream people who are convinced they're real. And if that's true, then the question isn't whether we're living in a simulation, it's how many layers deep we are and whether it matters. Chin's final paper on the subject ended with a line that got him both fame and a reputation for being slightly unhinged. The only difference between reality and simulation is that reality is the simulation you can't turn off. This brings us to Dr. Elena Vasquez, an evolutionary psychologist who stumbled upon perhaps the most disturbing implication of our capacity for continuous suffering. We've built our entire civilization around it. Dr. Vasquez was studying consumer behavior, trying to understand why humans are the only species that seems to actively make themselves miserable through their own choices. Every other animal seeks pleasure and avoids pain in pretty straightforward ways, but humans? We'll voluntarily watch 3-hour movies that make us cry, listen to sad music when we're already depressed, and spend money we don't have on things we don't need to impress people we don't like. Her breakthrough came when she realized that human suffering isn't just an inevitable byproduct of consciousness. It's the primary fuel of our economic system. Think about it. Every advertisement you've ever seen is basically a little machine designed to make you suffer. It shows you a life slightly better than yours, makes you experience the pain of not having that life, and then offers you a product that promises to close the gap. The entire consumer economy is built on manufacturing artificial inadequacy and then selling temporary relief from the pain of that inadequacy. But Vasquez discovered something even more twisted. We've become so sophisticated at this process that we've started selling the suffering itself as a product. Consider social media. The business model is literally to show you carefully curated highlights from other people's lives, trigger your comparison simulations, make you feel terrible about your own existence, and then sell your attention to advertisers while you're in that vulnerable state. We've created a global infrastructure for manufacturing envy, anxiety, and inadequacy. And we've made it so addictive that people pay for premium subscriptions to suffer more efficiently. Or take entertainment. We don't just watch movies and TV shows for pleasure. We actively seek out content that makes us feel terrible. Horror movies that trigger genuine fear responses. Dramas that make us experience fictional heartbreak. News programs that flood us with anxieties about problems we can't solve. We've industrialized emotional suffering and turned it into a multi-trillion-dollar entertainment industry. But here's where Vasquez's research gets really unsettling. She discovered that this isn't accidental or evil. It's evolutionarily adaptive on a species level, even though it makes individual humans miserable. See, our capacity for chronic psychological suffering serves as a sort of evolutionary early warning system. A human who's anxious about the future is more likely to prepare for disasters. A human who's dissatisfied with their current status is more likely to innovate and improve their situation. A human who can experience the pain of hypothetical scenarios is less likely to make dangerous mistakes. But when you scale this up to billions of humans all suffering simultaneously, something remarkable happens. You get rapid technological and social evolution. Our collective misery drives innovation, creativity, and progress at a pace that no other species has ever achieved. We've essentially turned suffering into a renewable energy source for civilization itself. Vasquez started calling this the paradox economy, an economic system where the primary product being manufactured and consumed is human dissatisfaction, and where the engine of progress is powered by our collective inability to be content with what we have. And the really twisted part, the better we get at solving problems, the more sophisticated our suffering becomes. We've eliminated most physical threats, so our brains have pivoted to psychological and existential threats. We've solved material scarcity for much of the developed world, so we've invented spiritual and social scarcity to replace it. We're living in the safest, most prosperous, most connected time in human history, and we're more anxious, depressed, and existentially terrified than ever. We've created paradise and found a way to be miserable in it. But Vasquez's research revealed something even more profound. This process might be accelerating. As artificial intelligence and automation eliminate more sources of traditional suffering, physical labor, dangerous tasks, even complex decision-making, we're compensating by inventing entirely new categories of psychological pain. She documented what she calls meta-suffering, feeling bad about feeling bad, being anxious about being anxious, being depressed about being depressed. We're creating recursive loops of emotional pain that feed on themselves and grow stronger over time. And as our technology gets more sophisticated at predicting and manipulating our emotional states, we're entering what Vasquez calls the suffering singularity, a point where the artificial creation of human dissatisfaction becomes so efficient and pervasive that we lose the ability to distinguish between authentic emotions and manufactured ones. Your smartphone already knows your emotional patterns better than you do. It knows exactly when to show you content that will make you feel insecure, lonely, or inadequate. It can predict your emotional responses to different stimuli with frightening accuracy and adjust its manipulation strategies in real time. We're approaching a future where every surface in our environment could be an intelligent display capable of triggering specific emotional responses, where every interaction is optimized to maintain us in a state of productive dissatisfaction, where our suffering is so precisely calibrated that we don't even recognize it as suffering anymore. Vasquez's final paper included a line that haunts me. We spent millions of years evolving the capacity to suffer, and now we've created machines that are better at making us suffer than we ever were at making ourselves suffer. The question isn't whether we're headed for dystopia, it's whether we'll notice when we arrive. But there's a twist to all of this that Vasquez discovered in her latest research. Some people seem to be developing immunity to the paradox economy. They're finding ways to experience genuine contentment and meaning despite being surrounded by systems designed to make them miserable. These people aren't necessarily happier in the conventional sense. They're just better at recognizing when their suffering is artificially manufactured versus when it's providing useful information. They've learned to distinguish between the pain that helps them grow and the pain that just helps them consume. And studying these people led Vasquez to a conclusion that nobody saw coming. Dr. James Wright was not someone you'd expect to solve one of the fundamental problems of human consciousness. He was a maintenance worker at a philosophy department, the guy who fixed the broken printers and unclogged the toilets, while PhD students debated the nature of reality in the rooms above him. But James had developed what he called accidental wisdom, insights that came from being invisible to the academic world while overhearing thousands of hours of philosophical discussions. He was like a janitor at the Large Hadron Collider who accidentally discovered a new particle while emptying the trash. One day, James was fixing a projector in a lecture hall where Dr. Vasquez was presenting her research on the paradox economy. As he worked, he listened to her describe how humans had become trapped in cycles of manufactured suffering, unable to distinguish between authentic emotions and artificial ones. And James realized something that all the PhD researchers had missed. He wasn't trapped in those cycles. See, James had spent decades watching academics torture themselves over questions that had no answers, stress about deadlines for projects that didn't matter, and compete for recognition from people they didn't respect. He'd seen brilliant minds waste their lives chasing validation from systems designed to keep them perpetually inadequate. But James had accidentally developed a different relationship with suffering. When his emotions told him to feel bad about something, he'd developed a habit of asking, "Is this feeling giving me useful information, or is it just noise?" Most of the time, it was noise. James started documenting his observations, writing them down in a notebook he kept in his maintenance card. He noticed that the professors who seemed most miserable were also the ones most convinced that their suffering was profound and meaningful. They turned their anxiety into an intellectual identity, their depression into a philosophical stance, their dissatisfaction into a badge of sophistication. Meanwhile, James had learned to recognize manufactured emotions the way a mechanic recognizes the sound of a failing engine. He could feel his brain trying to run those comparison simulations that Dr. Chen had identified, but instead of getting caught up in them, he just observed them like weather patterns passing through his consciousness. Oh, there's my brain trying to make me jealous of that guy's car. There's my brain trying to make me anxious about retirement. There's my brain trying to make me feel inadequate because I'm not published in any journals. And then he'd get back to fixing whatever was broken. James's notebook eventually came to the attention of Dr. Sarah Chun, no relation to Dr. Marcus Chun, a researcher studying what she called emotional metacognition, the ability to think about thinking about emotions. She was fascinated by James's accidental development of what appeared to be a natural immunity to the paradox economy. Dr. Sarah Chun started studying James and found something remarkable. His brain showed all the same patterns as everyone else's. He was running the same constant simulations, experiencing the same parallel emotional lives, generating the same recursive suffering loops. But he had somehow learned to observe these processes without being controlled by them. It was like he'd developed an operating system for consciousness that could run all the normal human emotional software without being crashed by it. Chun started calling this phenomenon conscious debugging, the ability to recognize and interrupt the automatic processes that generate artificial suffering. And James wasn't alone. She found dozens of people who had independently developed similar capabilities, usually through jobs or life circumstances that forced them to observe human behavior from the outside. Night shift security guards who watch people's lives play out on surveillance cameras. Customer service representatives who listened to thousands of people describe their problems. Uber drivers who heard confessions from strangers in their back seat. Massage therapists who felt the physical tension that people carried from emotional stress. These people had accidentally become anthropologists of human suffering, and their outside perspective had given them a kind of immunity to the systems designed to manipulate their emotions. But Dr. Chen's research revealed something even more interesting. This immunity seemed to be contagious. When people with conscious debugging skills spend time with people trapped in suffering cycles, the trapped people started developing the same observational capabilities. It was like emotional literacy spreading through social networks, creating pockets of resistance to the paradox economy. Chun started mapping these resistance networks and discovered something that gave her hope. They were growing exponentially. Every person who developed conscious debugging skills seemed to inadvertently teach it to several others, who then taught it to others, creating a viral spread of emotional immunity. And the people in these networks weren't just happier. They were more creative, more productive, and more resilient. They were solving problems instead of just suffering about them. They were building things instead of just consuming them. They were connecting authentically instead of just performing connection. But here's the really interesting part. They weren't trying to eliminate suffering entirely. They'd learned to distinguish between productive suffering and manufactured suffering. They could still feel genuine grief, authentic fear, and meaningful anxiety when those emotions contained useful information. They'd just become immune to the artificial versions. Chen's research suggested that human consciousness might be evolving in real time, developing new capabilities in response to the novel environment of the information age. We might be witnessing the emergence of a new type of human, not through genetic evolution, but through cultural and cognitive adaptation. James, meanwhile, had been promoted ahead of maintenance, partly because he'd become the unofficial therapist for stressed-out professors who found his perspective refreshing. He still carried his notebook, still observed the patterns of human suffering, but now he was also teaching others how to recognize them. His final note in that original notebook read, "Turns out the secret to happiness isn't avoiding suffering. It's learning to tell the difference between the suffering that's trying to teach you something and the suffering that's just trying to sell you something. Once you can make that distinction, everything else gets a lot simpler." Which brings us to the final piece of this puzzle, and the person who tied it all together. Dr. Maya Patel, a consciousness researcher who had been following the work of Sarah, Dr. Chun, Dr. Vasquez James, and Dr. Sarah Chun. I know, too many chins, but that's science for you. Dr. Patel had been studying what philosophers call the meaning problem. The question of whether life has inherent meaning, or whether meaning is something we create, or whether the whole concept of meaning is just a cognitive illusion that helped our ancestors survive. But tracking the discoveries of our other researchers, Patel realized they'd collectively stumbled upon something much more profound. Humans might be the universe's way of creating meaning itself. Think about it. We're the only species that we know of capable of experiencing existential dread, the deep, cosmic anxiety about whether any of this matters. But we're also the only species capable of creating art, music, literature, philosophy, and love stories that can make existence feel profoundly meaningful, even in the face of entropy and death. We're meaning-making machines, and our capacity for suffering is the raw material we use in that manufacturing process. Every human who has ever lived has had to confront the fundamental meaninglessness of existence. The fact that we're temporary arrangements of atoms on a small planet orbiting an ordinary star in an unremarkable galaxy, in a universe that will eventually experience heat death. And yet, somehow, we keep creating beauty, forming connections, and finding reasons to continue existing. Dr. Patel realized that our suffering simulations, our parallel emotional lives, our recursive anxiety loops, all of it might be part of a massive computational process where consciousness is trying to solve the meaning problem through trial and error. Every time you lie awake at 3 a.m. wondering if your life has any point, you're not just experiencing personal anguish. You're participating in a species-wide experiment in meaning creation. Your brain is running millions of tiny philosophical thought experiments, testing different frameworks for understanding existence, and occasionally stumbling upon insights that make life feel worth living. And when those insights work, when you find something that makes existence feel meaningful, even temporarily, you tend to share them with other humans through art, conversation, or simply by modeling a way of living that others find inspiring. Dr. Patel started calling this the meaning economy, a parallel system to the paradox economy, where humans trade insights, perspectives, and frameworks that help each other find significance in an apparently insignificant universe. And here's the beautiful part. Unlike the paradox economy, which runs on manufactured scarcity and artificial inadequacy, the meaning economy runs on abundance. When you share a meaningful insight with someone, you don't lose it. It often becomes more meaningful for you. When you help someone else find purpose, it deepens your own sense of purpose. The meaning economy is anti-rivalrous. The more people who participate, the richer, everyone becomes. Dr. Patel's final breakthrough came when she realized that the escape artists that Dr. Sarah Chun had identified weren't just immune to manufactured suffering. They had become skilled participants in the meaning economy. They learned to harvest insights from their suffering instead of just being consumed by it. They were like emotional alchemists, transforming the base metal of human anxiety into the gold of wisdom and compassion. And this led Dr. Patel to her final, most audacious hypothesis. What if the entire evolution of consciousness, from the first self-aware creature to our current state of existential complexity, has been the universe's way of bootstrapping itself into meaning? What if consciousness isn't just an accidental byproduct of neural complexity, but rather the universe's way of experiencing itself, understanding itself, and ultimately, caring about itself? In this view, every moment of human suffering and joy, every dream, every anxiety attack, every creative breakthrough, every love story, and every philosophical crisis is part of a vast cosmic process where reality is trying to figure out why it exists. We're not separate from the universe looking at it from the outside. We are the universe becoming aware of itself, piece by piece, person by person, dream by dream. And our suffering? It's not a bug or a punishment, or even just an evolutionary tool. It's the growing pains of a cosmos learning to experience meaning. Dr. Patel's final paper ended with a line that captures everything we've discovered. We suffer, therefore the universe cares. We dream, therefore reality has imagination. We create meaning, therefore existence isn't meaningless. We are not in the universe. We are the universe becoming conscious of its own significance. So here we are, back where we started, lying awake at 3 a.m., running through our catalog of embarrassments and anxieties. But now you know what's really happening in those moments. You're not just suffering pointlessly. You're participating in the most ambitious project in the history of existence. The attempt by consciousness itself to create meaning in an apparently meaningless cosmos. Every worry, every dream, every moment of existential dread is a data point in that cosmic experiment. And the beautiful thing is, you don't have to solve it alone. The meaning economy is always open for business, ready to trade insights and perspectives that can transform suffering into wisdom. The escape artists are out there, developing new tools for conscious debugging, accidentally teaching others how to distinguish between productive pain and manufactured misery. The future isn't about eliminating suffering. It's about learning to surf it, to harvest its insights while avoiding its traps, to participate consciously in the universe's attempt to understand itself. So the next time you're lying awake at 3 a.m., remember, you're not broken. You're not alone. You're part of something so vast and complex and beautiful that we're only just beginning to understand it. And maybe, just maybe, that's worth staying awake for.